Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Thank you for joining me for a preview of our upcoming production of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro. I'll start by talking about Mozart and then focus on Figaro itself, including the many people involved in its creation. When I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to your questions. If you are watching on April 6th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box. If you type them while I'm talking, I will see them when I get to the Q&A. If you're watching after April 6th and have questions, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Now I'll ask the magic people to share my screen. So Mozart is possibly the only composer that pretty much everyone loves. Violinist Isaac Stern. Mozart's music is like an X-ray of your soul. It shows what is there and what isn't. Playwright Arthur Miller. Mozart is happiness before it has gotten defined. Albert Einstein. The music of Mozart is of such purity and beauty that one feels he merely found it, that it has always existed as part of the inner beauty of the universe waiting to be revealed. Johannes Chrysothemis Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart, aka Wolfgang Amadeus, was born in Salzburg, Austria on January 27, 1756, to Leopold and Anna Maria Mozart. Leopold was a composer and music teacher in service to the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. Wolfgang was the youngest of 7 children, 5 of whom died in infancy. He had an older sister named Maria Anna, nicknamed Nannerl. According to his sister, the 3-year-old Wolfgang watched her studying keyboard, started studying himself, and then started composing at age 5. Anyone who has ever studied piano was told by their teacher that Mozart was composing sonatas at the age most of us were still struggling with scales. Or as the playwright Wendy Wasserstein said, because of Mozart, it's all over after the age of 7. During Mozart's childhood, his family traveled across Europe, presenting he and his sister as child prodigies. They began in 1762 and were on tour for 3.5 years, going to Vienna, Prague, Munich, Paris, and London. The touring life was not fun, and both Leopold and the children became critically ill during their time on the road. After years of touring, the family spent a year home in Salzburg, during which Mozart wrote 2 pieces that vied for position as his first opera. The first was the sacred Singspiel, The Obligation of the First Commandment, which premiered in March 1767. The second was Apollo and Hyacinthus, first performed in May of the same year. Mozart was 11 years old. When he was in his early teens, Mozart and his father went to Italy for 18 months. In Milan, the 14-year-old Mozart wrote the opera Mitridate Re di Ponto, which was a success and led to more commissions, including Ascania and Alba and Lucio Silla. Toward the end of his second Italian trip, Mozart wrote the first of his works to still be widely performed today, the motet Exultate Jubilate. He was now 17 years old. Around the same time, he got a job as a court musician for the ruler of Salzburg. He composed a lot in the following years, everything from symphonies to sonatas, string quartets, and serenades. Yet, despite artistic success, he was job hunting elsewhere. The main reason was that the pay in Salzburg was terrible. A second reason was a lack of opportunity. Salzburg had no place for opera, as its court theater had closed. And while Mozart wrote every kind of music, he himself said, "Opera comes to me before anything else." He took some long job hunting trips to Vienna and to Munich. Neither visit was successful, though the Munich trip resulted in a popular success with the premiere of La Finta Giardiniera. Time for a pet photo. I like to scatter pet photos into my talks on the theory that everyone's life is improved by looking at cute animals. The ones I'll show tonight reside with some of our Figaro company members. This is Rose, who lives with Jill Krinicki, our production stage manager. And you can see Rose doing her homework. At age 21, Mozart quit his Salzburg job and traveled around looking for work. In Mannheim, he fell in love with Aloysia Weber, one of 4 daughters in a musical family. He could not find work in Mannheim, so he went to Paris to look there. He fell into debt and started pawning his possessions. So Mozart's father found him a new job back in Salzburg as court organist. The money was decent, but Mozart was reluctant to accept, finally arriving back in Salzburg in 1779. He was now 23. 2 years later, his opera Idomeneo premiered with considerable success in Munich, and that proved a turning point. A couple months after this success, Mozart attempted to resign from his Salzburg job, was refused, and then abruptly fired a month later. So he moved to Vienna, where he became known as the best keyboard player in town. He also prospered as a composer, in particular with the opera The Abduction from the Seraglio, which was a huge hit in its 1782 premiere. This was his first opera in German, i.e. the vernacular, and told of 4 Europeans attempting to escape from a Turkish harem. Abduction was soon being performed throughout German-speaking Europe and fully established the 26-year-old Mozart's reputation as a great opera composer. Sometime during 1781, Mozart had moved in with the Weber family, who had moved to Vienna. Aloysia was now married, so Mozart's interest shifted to her sister, Constanza, and the two married in 1782. They eventually had 6 children, of whom only 2 survived infancy. For the next 3 years, Mozart produced orchestral concerts with himself as the main soloist, presenting 3 or 4 new piano concertos each season. The concerts were popular and made money, and Mozart and Constanza adapted their lifestyle accordingly. They unfortunately did not save much money, which would become a problem later on. Despite having had a hit with Abduction, Mozart did little opera writing in this time period, instead focusing on his piano career. But in 1785, Mozart began his collaboration with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. We will learn more about da Ponte soon. Their first collaboration was the Marriage of Figaro. We will come back to it, but for now, know that it was a success. Its reception in Prague later in the year was even better, and this led to a second collaboration with da Ponte, Don Giovanni, which premiered in 1787 and was a massive hit. Towards the end of the 1780s, Mozart's financial circumstances worsened. He was giving fewer public concerts, so his income shrank. This was a difficult time for musicians in Vienna due to a general economic slump and thus a decline in the ability of the aristocracy to support music. By mid-1788, Mozart and his family had moved from central Vienna to a suburb, and Mozart began to borrow money. Some biographers have suggested that Mozart was suffering from depression, and indeed his compositional output slowed, at least by comparison with his earlier years. That said, major works of the period include his last 3 symphonies, all written in 1788, and the last of the 3 da Ponte operas, Così fan tutte, which premiered in 1790. In what would prove to be Mozart's final year, he became very productive. He composed a great deal, including his last 2 operas and the unfinished Requiem. His finances began to improve, and he started paying off his debts. His son Franz was born in July 1791. A few months later, Mozart fell ill while in Prague for the premiere of La Clemenza di Tito, an opera written for Emperor Leopold II's coronation. He continued to work, conducting the premiere of The Magic Flute just a few weeks later on September 30th. Mozart's health deteriorated, and he became bedridden on November 20th. He died at home on December 5th, 1791. He was 35 years old. The exact cause of Mozart's death is not known. The official record lists severe military fever, which does not mean anything in modern medicine. Researchers have come up with 118 different causes of death. The most widely accepted theory is that he died of rheumatic fever. He was buried at the St. Mark's Cemetery outside the city. Legend says he was dumped in a communal grave and no one was there. But it was not the Viennese custom for mourners to attend a burial, and he was buried in a common grave, which referred to an individual grave for someone who was not an aristocrat. His modest funeral did not mean his death went unmourned, and memorial concerts in Vienna and Prague were well attended. In the period immediately after his death, his reputation rose, with several biographies written and complete editions of his works published. And this is the legacy Mozart left us. Over 600 pieces, including 41 symphonies, 36 violin sonatas, 27 piano concertos, 23 string quartets, 22 operas, 18 piano sonatas, 5 violin concertos, 4 horn concertos, over 100 dance pieces, and plenty of sacred music, chamber music, and more. And although it was not his epitaph, I always like this quotation from Mozart. "Music is my life, and my life is music. Anyone who does not understand that is not worthy of God." Now let's focus on The Marriage of Figaro, subtitled The Crazy Day. First, the story of the opera, which takes place in one day at the castle of Count and Countess Almaviva outside of Seville. Figaro and Susanna, servants to the Count and Countess, are preparing for their wedding. Susanna warns Figaro that the Count is pursuing her, and Figaro vows to thwart the Count's plans. Here, played by our video dog, is Gerald Finley at Glyndebourne.
Se vuol ballare, signor Contino, se vuol ballare, signor Contino, il chitarrino le suonerò, il chitarrino le suonerò, sì, le suonerò, sì, le suonerò.
The page Cherubino enters and confesses to Susanna that he's always falling in love. This is Marian Todorovich. Count Almaviva arrives, so Cherubino hides. The Count attempts to seduce Susanna, but is himself forced to hide when Don Basilio arrives. Eventually, the Count reveals himself. Figaro returns with the other servants, asking the Count to bless his forthcoming marriage to Susanna. The Count does so, but then delays the ceremony to later in the day. Act 2 opens with Countess Almaviva in her bedroom, mourning the loss of her husband's love. This is Renee Fleming. Susanna tells the Countess that she and Figaro have a plan to maneuver around the Count. Cherubino arrives, and Susanna steps into an adjoining room. The Count knocks on the locked bedroom door, so Cherubino hides in the dressing room. Almaviva demands it be unlocked, but the Countess refuses, claiming Susanna is inside. Almaviva leaves to get a crowbar, taking the Countess with him, and Susanna helps Cherubino escape by jumping out the window. The Count and Countess return, and both are shocked when Susanna exits the locked dressing room. Figaro arrives to gather everyone for the wedding, but is interrupted by the gardener, who is upset that someone jumped out the Countess's window and crushed his flowers. Figaro claims it was he who jumped. Three characters we met earlier, Marcellina, Bartolo, and Basilio, enter. They claim that Figaro is obliged to marry Marcellina to pay off an outstanding debt. The Count is delighted that the wedding will be called off, and the act ends in chaos. Later that day, Susanna tells Count Almaviva that she will meet him in the garden that evening. This is Alison Hegley and Andreas Schmidt.
Dunque in giardin verrai, E non mi mancherai. Verrai, non mancherai, non mancherai. Mi sento dal contento, pieno di gioia il cor. Mi sento dal contento, pieno di gioia il cor.
As Susanna leaves, the Count overhears her conspiring with Figaro and swears that he will not let Figaro defeat him.
A non lasciarti in pace, non questo contento. Tu non avresti audace, tu non avresti audace per dare a me tormento e forse ancor per ridere di mia felicità. Fa la speranza sola e le vedette mie, questa mi la consola, e giubilar mi fa.
Marcellina demands that Figaro pay his debt or else marry her, but then it turns out that he is her long-lost son by Dr. Bartolo. Everyone is happy about this except, of course, the Count. The Countess dictates a letter from Susanna to the Count confirming their meeting that evening in the garden. This is Renee Fleming and Alison Hagley. Figaro and Susanna's wedding finally takes place. During the dancing, Susanna slips the Count her letter. In the garden later that night, Figaro finds out about the letter, making him think Susanna is being unfaithful. He hides when Susanna and the Countess arrive, disguised as each other. Knowing that Figaro is listening, Susanna sings about love. This is Alison Hagley. In the dark garden, the disguises are a success. The Count declares his love for Susanna, who is really the Countess, while Figaro tells the Countess, who is really Susanna, about the Count. Figaro then figures out Susanna's disguise and the two embrace. The Count sees this and explodes with rage. But the real Countess steps forward, the Count asks her pardon, and the entire household celebrates a happy ending to a crazy day. So, how did we get here? There are a lot of pieces to put together and a lot of people to meet, but first meet Greta, who lives with Chris Farenthold, our assistant stage manager. Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais was a Paris watchmaker's son who was trained in his father's field. At age 21, he invented something that made watches more accurate, getting the attention of King Louis XV. At age 24, Beaumarchais married a wealthy widow and gave up watchmaking. He added de Beaumarchais to his name and adopted an elaborate coat of arms. He was appointed to teach harp to King Louis XV's daughters, eventually becoming a musical advisor to the royal family, then secretary counselor to the king, and then lieutenant general of hunting. He teamed up with a wealthy entrepreneur on a number of business ventures. He spent almost a year in Madrid and hoped to be made consul to Spain, but was rejected. So he started writing plays. His first play, Eugénie, premiered at the Comédie Française in 1767. Many others followed, mostly successfully. After his business partner died in 1770, Beaumarchais was plunged into years of lawsuits with the man's heir. He was also jailed for 4 months for something to do with a nobleman's lover. He worked as a spy, traveling around Europe on missions for King Louis XV. With funds from both the French and Spanish crowns, he set up a fake business to funnel aid to the American army, then fighting for independence from Britain. He published the complete works of Voltaire, who had recently died, purchasing 3 paper mills and setting up printing presses in Germany to avoid French censorship. He was married 3 times. His first 2 wives died under mysterious circumstances within a couple years of their wedding. He was accused by his enemies of poisoning them in order to get their money. He was tangentially involved in the French Revolution and tried to negotiate an arms deal for the French Revolutionary Army with Holland. While he was out of the country, he was declared a loyalist to the old regime by his enemies and spent 2.5 years in exile. He returned to Paris in 1796 and spent the last few years of his life in peace. He died at age 67. He is now most known for 3 plays called the Figaro plays: The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, and The Guilty Mother. They were written over a span of 20 years, and all follow Figaro, Count Almaviva, and Rosine, later the Countess Almaviva. The first play, The Barber of Seville, premiered in Paris in 1775, when Beaumarchais was 43 years old. You may know the plot from the Rossini opera. It's about Figaro, the barber of the title, helping Count Almaviva successfully woo Rosine. The play was a hit, performed worldwide in many languages. It was turned into several operas, with the most successful by Giovanni Paisiello premiering in 1782. Rossini's opera, the one we know best, was written in 1816, well after the time period we're discussing. Beaumarchais wrote The Marriage of Figaro as a sequel to Barber. The plot is pretty much the opera story I just told you. Count Almaviva has become bored with marriage to Rosine and wants to revive Droit de Seigneur to sleep with Figaro's fiancée Suzanne. So let's talk about this. Droit du Seigneur was the right of a lord of a manor to sleep with a new bride on her wedding night, i.e. before the groom. So it's the idea that a nobleman literally owns his subjects. Over a decade before Figaro was written, Voltaire wrote a play called Le Droit du Seigneur, but it was set in medieval times, because the practice did not exist at all in the 18th century. In fact, some scholars say that it was mostly an ancient legend, with no evidence that it was ever a regular practice. So Voltaire basically invented this legalized rape for his dramatic purposes. Then Beaumarchais used it too. From our 21st century lens, we might think it was an 18th century reality, but it was not. This is Maya, who lives with Benjamin Sieverdeen, who is singing Dr. Bartolo with us. Back to the play. It was finished by 1778, and the Comédie Française planned to perform it in 1781. The censor initially approved it, but a private reading at the French court shocked King Louis XVI, so he forbid a public performance. His wife, Marie Antoinette, wanted it performed, but the king overruled her. Beaumarchais revised Figaro over the next 3 years, moving the action from France to Spain. The king finally lifted the ban in 1784, and it opened to the public that April. It ran for 68 consecutive performances, earning more at the box office than any other French play in the 18th century. The French aristocracy in particular embraced the play, but a British visitor, not an aristocrat, wrote of its indecent merriment and gross immorality. We will come back to Figaro momentarily. The final play in the trilogy, The Guilty Mother, premiered in 1792, after the time period we're about to discuss. It takes place 20 years after Figaro, and is about the fact that the Countess got pregnant by Cherubino while the Count was out of the country. Cherubino died in battle, and the Count has his suspicions about this child, but of course he has an illegitimate child of his own. Anyway, now meet Lorenzo da Ponte, our librettist, whose life makes Beaumarchais' life look normal. Born Emanuele Conegliano in Vittorio Veneto, Italy, he was raised Jewish. When he was 15, his father converted his family to Catholicism. Emanuele took the name Lorenzo da Ponte from the bishop who baptized him. Da Ponte studied at the local seminary and was ordained a priest when he was 24 years old. He also began writing poetry. He moved to Venice, where he led a very dissolute life, to put it mildly, despite being, again, a priest. It was alleged that he lived in a brothel and would organize the entertainments there. He made political mistakes too, such as a speech that proclaimed that laws were the cause of unhappiness. He was banished from Venice in 1779 on the grounds of libertinage, blasphemy, sacrilege, and adultery. He was also accused of eating ham on a Friday. Now 30 years old, he moved to Austria, working as a writer and attaching himself to various patrons. He then got a job in Dresden, translating theater libretti. When he was 34, he got a job as official court librettist in Vienna. He held that post until the emperor who had hired him died in 1790. He then traveled around Europe, then went to London, accompanied by his wife and children. After working as a grocer and Italian teacher in England, he became librettist at the King's Theatre in London in 1803. 2 years later, bankruptcy forced him to flee to the United States. He was now 56 years old. The family settled in New York City first, then outside of Philadelphia, where he ran a grocery store. He returned to New York to open a bookstore and became friends with a real estate developer who helped him get an unpaid job as the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia College. He published his memoirs in 1823, and their accuracy has been, shall we say, questioned. A few years later, he became an American citizen at age 79. Da Ponte remained committed to opera and was present at the first full performance of Don Giovanni in the US in 1825. A few years later, he arranged funding for an opera company to come over to the US from Italy. Their season was a financial flop. So he decided the problem was the lack of a good opera house. And in 1833, at age 85, he built the Italian Opera House, the first theater built specifically for opera in the US. It lasted 2 seasons before he had to sell it to pay the company's debts. He died in 1838 and was buried in a cemetery on 11th Street. In 1909, that cemetery was paved over, and everyone's remains were moved to Queens. No one knows the exact current location of Da Ponte's grave. These are Ham and Swiss, who live with Scott Gendel, our principal coach and accompanist. Back to Vienna around 1783. Mozart is 27 years old, Da Ponte is 34. Vienna is under the rule of Emperor Joseph II, then in his early 40s. He had been on the throne since his mid-20s and was a massive arts lover. And in 1783, he started an Italian opera company in Vienna. That didn't mean all the singers were Italian, just that they performed Italian operas as opposed to the German ones. The theater was run by Franz Xaver Wolfgang von Orsini-Rosenberg. He had been an Austrian diplomat for 20 years and was now the emperor's chief steward. For this new company, they recruited singers from Italian theaters, in particular 2 singers from Venice. English soprano Nancy, or Anna Stores, had been a child prodigy, performing publicly at age 8 and having a successful career in Italy as a teenager. She was 17 years old when she was recruited to the emperor's new company. One contemporary writer described her by saying, "Stores, the beautiful singer, enchanted eye, ear, and soul." The leading bass baritone was the Italian Francesco Benucci. He was 38 when he was recruited to the Vienna company and would eventually be the first Leporello in Don Giovanni and the first Guglielmo in Così fan tutte. One contemporary critic said, Benucci combines unaffected, excellent acting with an exceptionally round, beautiful, and full bass voice. The new company opened their first season in April 1783 with Antonio Salieri's The School of the Jealous. It was a hit. Mozart attended at some point and wrote to his father, "The Italian comic opera has started up here again and is proving very popular. The bass is particularly good. He's called Benucci." Stories and Benucci were considered the backbone of the company. After their first 2 months, the emperor told Count Rosenberg that if they could not be persuaded to extend their contracts, he might as well disband the entire company. This is Satchel, who lives with Margaret Gabrishak, who sings Marcellina with us. Now let's go back to the Beaumarchais play, The Marriage of Figaro, and talk a little about its political power. Georges Danton, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, said that the play killed off the nobility. Decades later, Napoleon called the play the revolution already put into action. Why? Well, a major issue is that the play shows servants as smarter than their noble masters. And in fact, the Countess has to ask her servants for help to regain her husband's attention. But that in itself wasn't horrible. There were a number of comedies with smart servants. But there's this. Late in the play, when Figaro discovers what he thinks is a plan for Suzanne to have a tryst with the Count, he addresses the non-present Count, saying, "Because you're a great nobleman, you think you're a great genius. Nobility, fortune, rank, position, how proud they make a man feel. What have you done to deserve such advantages? Took the trouble to be born, that's all. Otherwise, you're a rather ordinary man. While I, lost in the faceless crowd, have had to call on more knowledge, more calculation and skill just to survive than was needed to rule all of Spain for a century, and you dare to measure yourself against me." In the early 1780s, this is dangerous talk. The French Revolution will begin in 1789, 5 years after the play premiered. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, who wanted the play performed, were executed 4 years later. Indeed, over in Vienna, Emperor Joseph II, brother of Marie Antoinette, closed down a production of the play before it could open, saying it was too dangerous. He did, however, allow the play to be published. And speaking of Napoleon, this is Napoleon, who lives with Chris Farenthold, our assistant stage manager. So again, back to Vienna, now around 1785. Mozart has written 16 operas, with his most recent complete work being The Abduction from the Seraglio 3 years earlier. His last Italian opera had been Idomeneo in 1781, and he had not written an Italian comedy in a decade. As for Da Ponte, he had only written 4 opera libretti at this point. The first was Rich Man for a Day for Antonio Salieri, which had been a spectacular flop. Salieri said he would rather cut off his fingers than ever work with Da Ponte again. Mozart and Da Ponte worked together on a cantata in spring 1785, but did not know each other well. And there are a few versions of how Mozart landed on Figaro as his next opera. One says that the emperor attended the Viennese premiere of Paisiello's The Barber of Seville, the smash hit opera version of Beaumarchais' first play, and then said he wanted a musical setting of the sequel. Count Rosenberg discussed this with Mozart, which led to the writing of the opera. Other scholars point out that Mozart's friend Emanuel Schikaneder, future librettist of The Magic Flute, had been the director of the production of the Beaumarchais play that the emperor had shut down. So perhaps Mozart knew the play from him. At any rate, everyone agrees it was Mozart's idea, and he asked Lorenzo da Ponte, the official court librettist, to write it. Da Ponte accepted and spent about 6 weeks translating the French play into an Italian libretto. He was also responsible for getting permission from the emperor to write it at all. He promised he would remove all the overtly political speeches, including Figaro's "took the trouble to be born" speech. Of course, that still leaves a play where the servants outwit their masters, and the Countess has to ask her maid for help. But the emperor gave his okay. And there is some question as to why he approved the libretto when he had condemned the play. One theory is that Joseph was fairly progressive by the standards of his time. He wanted to rein in the nobility, giving them minimal political power, so an opera poking fun at them suited him. Da Ponte reduced the number of characters from the play, omitting a few minor roles, but a fair amount of it is very similar. For example, the scene in which Cherubino performs his song for the Countess exists in the play, including having Suzanne accompanying him on the guitar, although the lyrics are different. Figaro has a bigger role in the play than in the opera, as Da Ponte cut a number of his speeches. For example, there is a scene in the play in which Figaro says that he knows the only English words you need to know to get by in England, which are goddamn. True, the English put in a few other words here and there, but obviously goddamn is the basis of their language. Da Ponte wrote the libretto in pieces. Mozart would set the new text as soon as he got it, then wait for the next installment. The full libretto was finished by autumn 1785, and Mozart wrote to his father in November that he was over neck and head in its composition. Da Ponte and Mozart knew who would be playing these characters as they were writing them, so let's meet our cast. Susanna was sung by Nancy Storres, who you met earlier. She was 21 years old when she created Susanna. Figaro was sung by Francesco Benucci, the other singer you met earlier. He was 41. The Count was sung by 36-year-old baritone Stefano Mandini. He had had a big success as Count Almaviva in Paisiello's Barber of Seville, meaning he was now playing the same character in the sequel. The Countess was sung by 26-year-old Italian soprano Luisa Laschi, a regular member of the company. Cherubino was sung by Dorotea Busani, a 23-year-old Austrian soprano. She would later be the first Despina in Così fan tutte. Bartolo and Antonio were sung by the 43-year-old Francesco Busani. The Italian bass married Dorotea, who sang Cherubino, the same year that Figaro premiered. He would later be the first Don Alfonso in Così fan tutte. Marcellina was sung by Maria Mandini, a French soprano and wife of the baritone singing the Count. Don Curzio and Don Basilio were sung by Irish tenor Michael Kelly. He would go on to a career in England as a composer and theatrical manager. Barberina was sung by Austrian soprano Anna Gottlieb. Only 12 years old at the time, she would be the first Pamina in the Magic Flute when she was 17. This is Rosie, who lives with Kirsten Lippard, who is singing Cherubino with us. And that's Kirsten's daughter, Eva, in the photo too. Count Rosenberg originally wanted Figaro to premiere in his winter season, but then decided to mount another opera instead, which gave Mozart more time to work on his score. In the meantime, Mozart had another commission, an entertainment honoring the visit of the emperor's sister in February 1786. Not Marie Antoinette, a different sister. Joseph had like 6 of them. It was to take place inside the enormous orangery of the palace. So Mozart wrote the one-act piece, The Impresario, about performers auditioning for an opera company. Salieri wrote a one-act work called First the Music and Then the Words, about a composer and a librettist. The 2 pieces premiered after lunch, with Mozart's piece performed at one end of the orangery and Salieri's at the other. Mozart also found time to write 3 piano concertos and a bunch of chamber music during this period. After all, it's not as though writing the Marriage of Figaro was going to pay the bills. Mozart was paid 450 florins for the work, which is about $11,000 today, using some New York Times math. Da Ponte was paid 200 florins, or a little less than $5,000. Figaro went into rehearsal in spring 1786, only 2 years after the play had premiered. The company performed at the Burg Theater, Vienna's most important theater. It held 1,300 people in the audience and had about 35 players in the orchestra. The emperor attended the final dress rehearsal on April 29th, and the premiere took place on May 1st. Mozart conducted the first 2 of its 9 performances from the keyboard, as was the custom. The first performance was in general a success. It wasn't musically perfect, as the singers and orchestra were still figuring out this very long, challenging score. In addition, there were the expected cabals. One review referred to hissing from uncouth louts in the top balcony. At that time, encores of arias were standard practice in opera. On opening night of Figaro, 5 numbers were encored. At the second performance, 7 numbers were encored, and that included ensembles, not just arias. So the emperor, who was concerned about running time, banned encores of ensembles. There were even posters printed to that effect. Hungarian poet Ferenc Kaczynski saw one of the performances and wrote, "The joy which this music causes is so far removed from all sensuality that one cannot speak of it. Where could words be found that are worthy to describe such joy?" A couple months later, a Viennese newspaper said, Mozart's music was generally admired by connoisseurs at the first performance. The public, however, did not really know on the first day where it stood. Now, after several performances, one would be subscribing either to the cabal or to tastelessness if one were to maintain that Herr Mozart's music is anything but a masterpiece of art. It contains so many beauties and such a wealth of ideas as can be drawn only from the source of innate genius. So while it was a success, Figaro was not the box office smash that, say, The Barber of Seville had been. It had its greatest success in Prague that December. A local newspaper called the work a masterpiece and said, "No piece, so everyone here asserts, has ever caused such a sensation." So Mozart traveled to Prague that January. When he attended a ball, he saw that everyone was dancing to music from Figaro turned into plausible contradances and German dances. He added in his letter, "Here they talk of nothing but Figaro, play, blow, sing, or whistle nothing but Figaro, go to no opera but Figaro, and always Figaro. A great compliment to me, to be sure." He attended a Figaro performance, then conducted the next performance himself. In between, he gave a concert that included the premiere of his Symphony No. 38, now called the Prague Symphony. He left Prague in early February with commission to write a new opera for the Prague Theatre. That became Don Giovanni, his second opera with Da Ponte, which premiered 8 months later. This is Oreo, the family dog of Michael Adams, who sings Count Almaviva with us. So then what? Figaro made its way slowly around the world. As always, there were changes. Mozart himself wrote a couple new arias when a different soprano sang Susanna in Vienna. In the original version, both Marcellina and Don Basilio have arias in the final act. Those are almost always cut now, mostly so that the piece is not 4 hours long. But truthfully, Figaro was not a standard repertoire piece in its first 150 years. Da Ponte did not even produce it with his New York company in the 1830s, and he'd written the thing. So this was basically true of Mozart overall in the 19th century. His music was loved by musicians and not well known by audiences. As operas by Donizetti, Wagner, and Verdi came into being, Mozart's operas were considered old-fashioned, not sufficiently dramatic, and even musically simple, which they are definitely not. One 19th century writer said, "His music has served its purpose and its day has passed away, just as the days of stagecoaches and sailing packets have." To be clear, this is not what 19th century composers had to say about Mozart. Richard Wagner, a German composer. The most tremendous genius raised Mozart above all masters in all centuries and in all the arts. Camille Saint-Saëns, a French composer. Give Mozart a fairy tale and he creates without effort an immortal masterpiece. Tchaikovsky, a Russian composer. Mozart is the highest, the culminating point that beauty has attained in the sphere of music. In addition to being considered old-fashioned by audiences, Mozart operas in general, and certainly Figaro, require large casts of leading performers, most of whom have arias and who sing together a lot. In contrast, many 19th century operas only had a few leading singers. Rehearsing and performing Mozart took care and time, and that was not the 19th century business model for opera. Figaro received some performances in New York in the 19th century, but not many. It didn't premiere at the Metropolitan Opera until the company's 10th season in 1894. A review called it one of the most effervescent and captivating musical comedies ever conceived, but noted its rarity. The piece stayed in the Met's repertoire for a few years, but the 20th century made it disappear, with only a few performances early on. Then it disappeared entirely for 22 years. When it returned in 1940, a review wrote, "One was again freshly convinced of the inexhaustible inventiveness, the unfailing charm of its melodies, of its perfection of form, of its power of musical characterization." And indeed, the mid-20th century is when things start to change for Mozart's modern reputation. Along with some of his other operas, Figaro entered the standard repertoire. Over the next several decades, it became one of the most popular operas in the world, with its musical genius and theatrical humanity recognized in every possible language. In this 22-23 season alone, there are productions from Austria to India and from Sweden to Colombia. So what makes Figaro so special? On a musical level, the game changer was the use of ensembles. In Mozart's previous operas, and in everyone's previous operas, it was mostly arias, recitative, and the occasional duet or maybe quartet. Almost half of the music in Figaro is ensemble. The Act II finale lasts 20 minutes, something that had never been attempted before. More importantly, on an emotional level, Figaro transcends the stereotypes of comic opera at the time. Yes, it is a comedy, but the stakes are real and the emotions are real, and Mozart puts all of that into his music. And that's why I saved this clip from the opera for here. This is the Count asking the Countess for forgiveness in the final act. Again, Andrea Schmidt and Renee Fleming. Someone once asked Rossini, composer of The Barber of Seville, who was the greatest musician ever? Rossini responded, Beethoven. He was asked, well, what about Mozart? And he responded, oh, Mozart is not the greatest musician. He is the only. So here we are with Madison Opera's first production of The Marriage of Figaro in over a decade, and I'll introduce you to our cast, all of whom are returning to Madison Opera. Susanna is sung by Jasmine Haversham, who sang Eurydice in Orpheus in the Underworld with us last spring. The Countess is sung by Elizabeth Caballero, whose most recent role with us was the title role in Florencia en el Amazonas. Figaro is sung by Matt Bowler, whose most recent role with us was Osmin in The Abduction from the Seraglio. The Count is sung by Michael Adams, who debuted at Opera in the Park last summer. Carabino is sung by Kirsten Lippard, a former studio artist who sang Venus in Orpheus in the Underworld last season. And this is the balance of our wonderful cast. The production is directed by Dan Ragazzi, who directed The Magic Flute here, and conducted by Stephanie Rhodes Russell, who conducted Opera in the Park 2021. Our set and costumes are traditional and come from Detroit Opera. Final pet photo. This is Shumi, who lives with Elizabeth Caballero, who is singing Countess Almaviva. And a final quote before we go to questions, this one attributed to composer Franz Schubert. A world that produced Mozart is a world worth saving. So now let's go to questions. If you are watching this on April 6th, please type your question into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. If you are watching after that, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Okay. Hi, Harry. Do I know if Carabino has ever been played by a countertenor or tenor, or has it always been a trouser role? It has always been a trouser role in that is what Mozart wrote, and in fact, it is also was the case in the play. The play was written for a trouser role. That said, I can think of at least one time that I know of a countertenor singing the role, because of course it's such a great role that they want to sing it. But it's pretty much always trouser. Oh, hi, Carla. Just saying hi from Hawaii. This is a question from myself, evidently. To make it more simple, is there beloved opera you know that could be shortened by saying something about normal technology? Their beloved opera that could be shortened. I'm not actually sure how to answer this question. I'm sorry. So if there are no more questions, I will just thank you for being here. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and please come see Marriage of Figaro next month.